Good morning. It's March 26th here in Nashville, Tennessee. We are in Judge Philip Smith's courtroom. We are part of the Nashville Bar Association Oral Preservation Committee, and we'd like to welcome you to a conversation with another one of our distinguished brethren of the bar, Jack Norman Jr. With me representing the bar is Harold Donnelly and Gareth Aden. Tony Nolan of Val and Jennings, court reporters, have graciously donated their time and equipment to film the interview. And all of us at the Nashville Bar thank you very much for helping us in this worthwhile project, and thank you, most of all, Jack, for reluctantly agreeing to this interview. We very much appreciate you coming here today. Jack, you have been practicing law for over 60 years. You've had quite a distinguished career. You were in World War II. You were an officer in the Air Guard. You ran away to the circus at an early age. You finished law school. You also had an active part in Vietnam with the Air National Guard. You flew your own airplane. You had your own boat. You tried some of the larger cases in the state during your career, and now you're a special master and special judge in the Fourth Circuit Court here in Nashville. We'll get back to your background a little bit because I've just barely hit some of the minor points of it. You were born the son of Jack and Carrie Sneed Norman. Your father was considered by many to be the most powerful politician in the South and one of the premier trial lawyers of all times. Your classy mother was a descendant of most of Nashville founders. If you go through Nashville, you see Sneed Road, Edmondson Road, and see the Herberts and so forth, all of whom were related to Mrs. Norman. Mr. Norman and Mrs. Norman often entertained quite a bit, from the President of the United States on down to the lowest members of society. That fact and living in a household where it was filled with excitement and courtroom drama every day, what was it like growing up in that atmosphere?
Well, Hal, I guess I couldn't have asked for a better atmosphere to grow up in. I had a wonderful mom and dad. My father, as you say, was a man who completely devoted himself to the practice of law. I mean, he loved the practice of law and he excelled in the practice of law. I suppose you could say that my early life was ideal. I can't think of any other word to use. Good parents, good brothers, and a sister. Good place to grow up in, Nashville. Of course, back in those days, Nashville was a kind of relatively a small city. The population was about 150, 175,000 people. But it was a great place to grow up in.
Where did you live when you were a boy?
Well, I was born on Maxey Lane, which is out in East Nashville, and I have absolutely no memory of that whatsoever. Sometime shortly after, I guess, my birth, we moved to Westmoreland Drive, which is out off Natchez Trace in the, I guess you'd call Central Nashville District, and lived there for many years until after I started school. Then my dad bought a place over on Fairmont Drive, which is off West End in Ackland Park. And we lived there until I went off in the service. And when I came back from the service, they had moved to what is now Ensworth School.
And I believe your father named the school Red Gables. Is that the name of the house?
That was the name of the house.
The name of the house.
It was the name of that before Dad came along.
And he sold that to Innsworth, and
Innsworth.
Innsworth High
Yes.
School, or grammar school, was created there. And later on, your parents moved to Printer's Alley, is that correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, Printer's Alley was a pretty active place with strip joints and restaurants and bars and musical venues. Was that correct?
And a gambling joint.
And gambling joint or two,
Yeah.
occasionally upstairs.
Right.
And their home was the top floor of 213 Third Avenue
Third
North.
Avenue North, right.
And how long did they live there?
They lived there probably 8 or 10 years at the most, and then they moved down to Cheatham County to Sycamore, where the old Sycamore powder plant was, in a farm that was formerly built by Chief Justice McKinney of the Supreme Court.
I see. And at one time in your life, you moved to 213 Third Avenue North to live, did you not?
Right, yes. I'm going to say probably in about 1976, somewhere in that neighborhood, I moved to Prentice Alley and lived there for, I think, about 35 years.
And your office was directly below
Right.
your bedroom there. And how many other lawyers did you have there in the office with you?
At one time, we had about 11 other than me.
Okay.
6 upstairs and 6 downstairs.
And the arrangement was everybody was on their own.
Everybody was on their own. It was just a loose-knit group of what I call street lawyers.
And no one in the firm, even you and your family members, never formed any sort of partnership.
No, it was just, like I say, every man for himself. But everybody that ever came down there, somehow or the other, did well. I mean, nobody starved.
Well, I remember an article that appeared in the Nashville Banner several years ago that dwelt on that particular point. It listed all of the lawyers that had rented space down there that had gone on to elective service, either as judge or prosecutors or whatever. And it was a pretty astounding article. I believe Bob Battle wrote that.
Right.
You recall that article?
Yes.
And a lot of people don't realize that people in transit, lawyers in transit, often would come down. I remember Federal Judge John Nixon was there for a month or two,
Right.
as was Judge Randall White. Very short time. They while they were in between running for judge or seeking appointment or whatever, and you had them all the way from the U.S. District Court to the General Sessions Court,
Right.
as judges. Well, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let me go back to the time when you graduated from high school. Rumor has it that you were an underage enlistee in World War II. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I graduated from Duncan High School in 1944 when I was 17. And in July, I went into the Army Specialized Training Reserve Program. They were supposed to make an officer out of me. But to make a long story short, I ended up at Camp Blandon, Florida, in the infantry.
Okay.
And then I was sent overseas and into the Pacific, to Hawaii, and then down to the Kwajalein and Majuro and Tarawa. I was an equipment operator, heavy equipment operator.
Okay, and you, as many World War II vets, don't particularly like talking about any of your service in the war, and I'll respect that and will not go into that. But after the war, you returned to the States, and what'd you do then?
Well, I got back in the States in 1946, in the summer of 1946, and I really was kind of drifting with the wind. I can't think of anything better to say than that, because I enrolled in Peabody College on the GI Bill, and my subjects were recreational rhythmics, which was dancing, geography, basket weaving, and the fundamentals of football. And my classes started at 3 and ended at 6. and I was getting, I think, about $95 on the GI Bill, and I was just living the life of Riley. I mean, I just having one heck of a good time. That went on for a while until my father kind of got a little fed up with me, and at that time he had put on the Shrine Circus here in Nashville. He was a potentate and bought the Shrine Circus in. The man that owned the circus was a man by the name of Tom Pax out of St. Louis. So my dad, without my knowledge, got Mr. Pax to agree to give me a job with the circus. And he announced to me that I was going away with the circus. And my first thought was, the hell you say? But to make a long story short, next scene, I'm on the plane going to New York because the Pax show played big league ballparks. In New York, we were the Roy Rogers Thrill Circus. And so I got on the plane, went to New York, and started my circus career.
Well, and I don't want to downplay your involvement in the circus, but you were assigned to elephants, is that correct?
I was an elephant engineer.
You were an elephant engineer.
Right.
And perhaps we will just leave it at that and leave that to the audience's imagination as to what an elephant engineer
Well,
does.
you have a bucket, and you have a shovel, and you follow the elephant.
Okay. Well, and as you're traveling around with the circus, I assume you got to know a lot of the stars of that era, the circus stars.
Well, the circus probably has one of the worst caste systems in the world. I mean, they're the performers who are the elite, and then then there's everybody else, and I was everybody else. But yes, I knew the performers. I've helped put up the rigging, tear it down, and things of that nature, and it was really one of the greatest times of my life.
And after you'd been there a couple of years, I take it that you noticed this beautiful young lady whose picture was on the front of Life magazine, as I recall, next to a huge cannon. And it was one of the flying zucchinis, Dewena zucchini. And she was doing the high trapeze act also. I'm sure you remember that.
Yes.
Tell us about the first time you remember seeing her.
Well, when I was, she was on the show in New York. She was doing the flying trapeze, not the cannon.
Okay.
But I met them, and because I didn't, like I say, the caste system was the caste system, and I knew how younger brothers, both of them, Hugo and Renee, had been to college at the University of Florida, and so I knew them, and through them I met Dewena and finally Sister Egley.
Okay. And how long did you date her before you married her?
We got married in 1950, and my circus career had ended, and I was in the law practice then.
And what about her career? Did she continue on?
She continued, yes. She was the closing act on the Ringling Show for about 7 years
Okay.
with the cannon.
And for those that don't know, what is the human cannonball?
Well, it's just what it is. I mean, it's a big cannon, and the person doing the cannon act slides down in the barrel and is ejected and flies through the air and lands on the net.
It's about, what, 200 yards in the air? Is a long way.
Well, she got shot over 3 Ferris wheels.
3 Ferris wheels.
Mm-hmm.
Were you ever nervous seeing her do that, or was she ever nervous?
No, she was a typical show person, and that was her job, and it was just routine to her.
So at some point, you decided that since you had your law degree, that you were going to come back here and practice law. Is that correct?
Well, my dad had a lot to do with that because, quite frankly, I was loving life on the circus as much as I loved it when I was in Peabody, and he said, it's time for you to register for law school, which was at the old YMCA, and so I reluctantly registered to go to law school. I think tuition back in those days was $150 for the whole year. And of course, that was paid for by the GI Bill, so.
And when you graduated, what did you do?
What to do?
Right.
I started practicing law the next day. In fact, I graduated in March. Well, no, actually, I learned I'd passed the bar sometime in the latter part of February. And I think I got my license on March the 3rd, I believe, 1950. And I hadn't finished law school because, you see, back in those days, you could take the bar exam in January if you didn't finish law school until June. And I took the bar exam and somehow I passed it. I don't know how, but I passed it. So I decided I was going to quit law school and start being a lawyer the next day. And I showed up at the office. And that evening, you know, it was about time for me to get ready to go to law school, and I was just laying around not doing much. And Dad said, "Aren't you going to be late to law school?" I said, "I'm not going to law school anymore. I'm starting to practice law like you did." He did the same thing. But his was out of necessity. I mean, his family.
What you're referring to, I think, is the story as I've heard it. Mr. Norman was going to Vanderbilt Law School, and I believe he's a founder's medalist, and within 2 weeks of graduating, he was walking out the door, and the dean says, "Where are you going?" And Mr. Norman said, "I'm going to go practice law. I passed the bar." I said, "Well, you can't do that. You got to graduate." So I'm not going to be involved in that. He left.
That's exactly.
Never got his degree from Vanderbilt.
So I was going to do the same thing with the Y, but I was told in no uncertain terms I was going to finish law school, which I did, and which I should have.
Now, when you first started practicing, who was in the office at 213? And this is where you stayed all your private practice.
This was in the old Exchange building.
Exchange building, okay.
That later burned. But that's where our office was when I first started practicing.
Okay.
And my dad and a man by the name of Jack Keefe, who was a brilliant man, could sit down and play anything on the piano you want him to. He was in radio, started in medical school, then decided he wanted to go to law school, and had a radio career. And one night, President Hoover, I believe, or somebody was speaking, and my dad was manipulating the controls or something, I don't know, but at any rate, they introduced the president, I believe, was Hoover. And my dad was supposed to switch it off, but he forgot to switch it off and said, "Who wants to hear that SOB anyhow?" Except he spelled it out, and not my dad, Mr. Keefe did this. And so he lost his job, and he lost his broadcasting license for a while, and all that. But he was quite a fellow.
And how long did you stay in the Exchange building?
Well, we stayed in the Exchange building until, I'd say, the latter part of 1950. Whenever it burned, we moved out 2 weeks before it burned.
Okay. And you moved into 213 Third Avenue North?
At that time, 213, our office was on the second floor. Seaboard Finance had the first floor, and our office was on the second floor. The third floor was vacant, was just a big old empty shell. And Mom and Dad built an apartment there.
And tell us a little bit about your early practice. I mean, here you are, you get out of law school, you hang up a shingle with your dad there. Where'd you get your cases from? What'd you do? Give us a typical day.
Well, there were three of us. There was Joe Binkley and Bob Jennings and myself. And every morning we'd go over to criminal court, and either before Judge Hart or Judge Gilbert, and we'd sit in the prisoner's box. They had a prisoner's box. and they'd call all the cases that were set, and Judge Hart would appoint us to represent somebody. Now, mind you, the trial was probably that day, but we'd get into it, we'd represent them, and believe it or not, they had darn good representation. And we pulled off some near miracles in there. I mean, in criminal cases. I remember one time we got a not guilty verdict, and Judge Hart got so upset he just threw his file off the bench right on the floor. But as far as money was concerned, there wasn't any such thing as, you know, getting paid for representing indigent clients. I mean, you just went in there and you represented them because the court said you had to, and you did your best. But every once in a while you get a fee. I remember I got an airplane, I got a old Chevrolet convertible, and, you know, so we'd take anything.
And aside from your criminal practice, did you try any personal injury or divorce?
Well, yeah, my dad he had been criminal, and he was in the process of switching from mainly criminal to mainly personal injury, plaintiff's personal injury. And I would help him, and I'd do a lot of divorce. Standard fee in a divorce case was $56.50. $50 would be yours, and $6.50 was the filing fee for a woman. $11 was the filing fee for a man. And I had my old book, my first year 1950 book, had it out, meant to bring it today, and walked off and forgot. So that shows you what's happening to my mind. But I was looking through that book, and I see fees like $5, $3, $10. And you know, back in those days, that was good money.
Did your father associate you on cases?
Yeah, he associated me on some cases. I think the first year, from March of 1950 through the rest of the year, I think I made $7,000. And I thought I was the richest man in Nashville. My goal at that time was to make $25,000.
Did he sort of take you under his wing, or did he make you just fly alone, or how did he introduce you to the practice of law, Mr. Norman Sr.?
Well, I flew alone. I mean, let me put it that way. Now, don't misunderstand me. He'd take me in on cases, but you know, it wasn't long before you know, it was my bed. I had to lie in it.
And when he moved more into personal injury, did you also move in that direction?
Well, yeah, I moved in that direction to some extent because I was doing a lot of criminal work, and I was doing beginning to do a lot of domestic relations work.
I remember back at that time that some of the defense attorneys would refer to you and Mr. Norman and your brother Seth Norman. They would refer to you as Frank and Jesse and the old man. Talking about the James gang.
I know.
For personal injury cases.
Yeah. Well, we had a lot of luck back in those days.
Well, you hit some pretty big verdicts, did you not, back in those
Mm-hmm.
days? Yeah. Speaking of verdicts and how they've changed, I recall years ago in the early 70s in one of the outlying towns where you and I tried a personal injury case together, and I think the specials were only like $450, but the jury came back with something like $200,000, and that was touted as the largest verdict that had ever been handed down in the 200-year history of that county. Now, that's really changed a lot now, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. That was in Murfreesboro.
In Murfreesboro, I believe.
Right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, times have changed. You're right.
In looking back over your 60 years from the time you first started until today, if you were trying to explain this to your granddaughter or whomever, how would you say it's changed? The practice of law is now different than it used to be. And
Well,
has it changed for the better?
Two things have, in my opinion, affected the practice of law more than anything else. One is discovery. I like to say I practiced law back in the golden days, BD, before discovery. That's one thing that's changed the law. And of course, the next thing that's changed the law more than anything is the computer. I mean, the computer has just completely changed the practice of law.
But if you take, say, for example, Judge Smith does a lot of divorce cases here, and you also do as a special master and as a special judge here. What would be the principal differences between filing a divorce case 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and filing one today?
Well, back in those days, you'd file your divorce case. You might send out some interrogatories. You could do that. Very seldom. Most of the time, you just got your client, got your witnesses, and went to trial.
And it's pretty easy pleadings to
Yeah,
draft.
pleadings were nowhere near as complex as they are today.
And now, I mean, there's several pieces of paper and a lot of money that you've got to put up just to file a simple divorce, it appears to me.
Oh, yeah, the time you do all the things that you really need to do to cover yourself, and that's something else that's dramatically different today than it was back when I practiced law, or when I started practicing law. You didn't have to watch your backside as much as you do today.
You think there was more civility at the bar than there is today?
Yeah, definitely.
Why is that?
Well, Al, I guess it's a reflection on the whole country. I mean, look at today. Look at the mess going on in Washington, here in our legislature. I mean, people calling each other names, people disrespecting the President of the United States. I don't care who he is or she is. It's just something that I'm really concerned about, if you want to be honest with you about it.
Could it have something to do with the size of the bar? What I'm getting at, years ago, when there were just 300, 400, 500 members of the bar, basically all you folks lived close to each other. You went to the same restaurants. You saw each other in court every day. I suppose you couldn't afford to get mad at too many of them, or you wouldn't have any friends left.
Well, I like to say that when I first started practicing law, that shortly thereafter, I think I knew almost every lawyer in town that tried cases. Now, there were some lawyers that never went to trial and
Right.
dealt with things like tax matters and things of that nature that I didn't have any contact with. But I knew just about everybody that did any trial work. And if somebody told me something, if some lawyer told me something, it was like that. I mean, there wasn't going to be any ifs, ands, and buts about it. I mean, I could rely on it, and
In looking back over your career, what attorneys stand out in your mind as being role models and really good lawyers?
First,
and I know there are many of them, and you can't possibly name them all.
There are many of them, yeah. But first and foremost would be Z. Alexander Luby. Mr. Luby, number one, was the epitome of a gentleman. He had a great deal of dignity. He was abused a lot. A lot of lawyers insist on calling him Alexander because he was African American. Some of the older judges were sometimes a little short with Mr. Luby. But I had been brought up in a segregated society. I didn't know any better. I mean, I thought that was the way it was supposed to be until I went away in the service. And then when I was in the service, I began to ask myself a lot of questions. And when I came back, my attitude had changed completely. And I saw the struggle that Mr. Luby was going through, and that affected me a lot. Always, it affected me all through the rest of my life.
You remember on, I believe, April 19th, 1960, when some racist blew up his house?
Yeah, I certainly do. And then his protege, Senator Avon Williams, was also a person that I respected. And he was my senator. Living in the downtown area, he was
Right.
my senator.
And in the criminal law area, who do you think the giants were at that time besides your father?
Well, Carl Harding and Frank Taylor were two giants. I'm talking about the early on.
Right.
I was going to say, Joe Binkley came along later on,
Right.
but
What about Mr. John Hooker Sr.?
Mr. Hooker was, he was like somebody asked Billy Sherrill who's the best producer you ever knew was, and he said, well, there's Owen Bradley and then there's the rest of us. And that's the kind of way I felt about Mr. Hooker. There was Mr. Hooker and then there's the rest of us.
And who do you think was maybe the best in criminal and civil defense, personal injury cases or plaintiff's cases? Who were the giants?
The giants, Lindsay Davis, Joe Cummins, Matt Glasgow, Francis Stewart, my mind just closes up on me, but there were more than that. But there's some of them that immediately come into mind.
And who were some of your favorite judges and why?
My favorite judges? Well, when I first started practicing law, we had two criminal judges, Charles Gilbert and Chester K. Hart. And they've never been two finer judges than those two. On the circuit bench was Bird Douglas, Frank Langford, and Richard Dews. And they were good judges. Judge Langford was a little cantankerous every once in a while, but once you knew what he wanted, you'd get along fine with him, as long as you did, what he expected you to do. General Sessions judges were John Draper, who later became a criminal judge, was a fine judge. Bird Douglas, an outstanding judge, and Richard Dews. And that was our judicial system. We had a county judge who was Shelton Luton, and we had some chancellors, Chancellor Adams, Chancellor, I'm trying to think of his name.
Lentz?
No, Chancellor Lentz came on afterwards. Chancellor Lentz was a real good friend of mine.
Did it ever bother you or interfere with your practice that you were friends of a lot of these judges?
No, I mean...
You think that hurt you in any way?
No, I don't think it helps or hurts you. I mean, judges are human beings too. They're allowed to have friends. And like you pointed out a while ago, you could have an adversary in the courtroom that you hated the ground he walked on while you were in the courtroom. Ready to fight, fist fight, or anything else. And walk out the door, you go to lunch together.
And that was quite common back in that era, wasn't it?
Well, certainly.
What do you think are the true traits of a trial lawyer?
I guess the ability to think on your feet, be a good orator, be a man of your word. That's real important. Thoroughly prepare your case. And that sums it up pretty much, I think.
If you
I understand that human beings are human beings, and they have a lot of shortcomings. And not everybody's perfect.
Right.
In fact, very few people, if any, are perfect.
If you had a magic wand and you could change the practice of law by just waving it and to try to make it better, what would you do to try to make the practice of law today better than it is?
Restore civility to the practice of law.
Have you thought about how we could do that? I mean, with the bars getting so much bigger, and we also have the DUI laws now, where no lawyer wants to have even one drink downtown before going home. Which in the old days, everyone would have a drink, it seemed like, before they went home. Now that's over. We don't have the same meeting places. We used to all meet for breakfast at the Stallman Building or other places, and we don't have those things. You got any ideas as to how we might interject that civility back into and camaraderie back into the practice?
Well, you've got to respect people. I mean, you've got to, as I say, be straightforward and honest with your opponent. I guess just live a decent life and take into consideration that other people think differently from what you think, and they have a right to express their opinion just like you have a right to express your opinion, and you have a right to express your opinion in public without having to worry about somebody wanting to shout you down or things of that nature.
After all these years of practice and all these thousands of cases, both federal and civil, on both sides of the fence, if you had it to do over again, starting back 50 years, would you still go down this path again?
Well, Hal, to be honest with you, I never had, when I was young, a strong desire to become a lawyer. I mean, I became a lawyer largely because of my father, and I have him to thank for that. I mean, in a way, he made me be a lawyer, but I've never regretted it. Don't misunderstand me. But I've lost your question now.
If you had it to do all over again, would you go into stay in the circus, or would you go into practice of law, or what?
Well, if I had to do it all over again, I'd do the same things I did in this life. God has been very good to me.
Okay.
Jack, I had one question, because I had the great honor and privilege of growing up with a group of lawyers called Hooker, Keeble, Dodson, and Harris in the early part of my practice, and I used to love to hear them sit around in the morning over coffee and talk about the interesting personalities that they had known and met in law practice. And I thought it would be fun to hear what ones, in terms of just being odd or quirky personalities, people that you remember from law practice that sort of made the bar special.
You mean some of the lawyers that?
Yeah, the lawyers or the judges that were just different and sort of fun in a different way.
Well, I can remember an old lawyer by the name of John Hildrop.
I've heard of Hildrop. Tell us about it.
And Mr. Hildrop was a man of unquestioned integrity. One of the old school, and he told this story about this man that came to see him and wanted Mr. Hildrop to do something pretty unethical, I think, and offered Mr. Hildrop $50, and Mr. Hildrop said no way he was going to do it. And the man kept on going up, and finally Mr. Hildrop said, get out of my office, because you're getting close to my price. But gosh, I don't know, lawyers are generally good, great, decent, honest people. And the backbone of this country, if you want the truth of it. I mean, if we ever lose the respect for the judicial system and for the courts, then we're gone. That's just it.
I very much agree with you on that. And I also, after my practice, share the same feeling you do, that the great vast majority of lawyers are good and honest and respectable people. What about your cases, Jack? There are always one or two cases in a person's career that they're proudest of or feel like have the greatest meaning to them. Do you have anything that in that category you could share with us or tell us about?
Well, Garth, the greatest words that any good trial lawyer can hear is, "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." That is the most satisfying statement that you can enjoy and receive as a lawyer. Because when you get in criminal cases, you just put everything you have into the case. I mean, civil cases, you're talking about money. Divorce cases, divorce cases are important because a lot of times you're talking about children.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about somebody going to jail and being locked up and lose their life and their liberty, you're talking about important stuff. And so you just get so much satisfaction out of the practice of criminal law. Of course, you get heartbreaks out of it too, but it's very rewarding. Of course, civil cases, we represented plaintiffs, my dad and I, and we got some good verdicts, some big verdicts. But a lot of times when I first started practicing law, I did a lot of federal court practice, moonshiners, because there were a lot of those back in those days. Most of those were heard down in federal court. And, I would go down and generally they'd go to jail. Everybody knew everybody. I mean, the moonshiners knew the officers, and the officers knew the moonshiners. And, it wasn't anything personal.
Well, you also represented a lot of the strippers down in Printer's Alley on occasion, if they had problems. And all the bartenders down there, you had all those folks flock to your office on Friday afternoon.
Well, is there any such thing as taking the Fifth Amendment here? No, yes, I represented people from all walks of life.
And Jack, you mentioned that you had tried several plaintiff's cases, and I know several of them were large verdicts and all that, but I also recall that you on occasion would defend cases, and one case I'm thinking about is a case that occurred, I believe, out on Nolensville Road. There was construction going on out there, and the workers were staying all night there. They had to sleep in these little cabins and so forth, and there was one young particular worker there that was feeling his oats. And do you remember that case that happened out there, the pulling contest across the Nolensville Road?
Well, yeah, I remember it very well, but I don't think we can talk about it. But number one, it wasn't what it was. Is they had private fire halls back in those days.
Okay.
And there was one out on Nolensville Road. I represented the man that owned it, and he hired a lot of railroad people, and he hired a lot of to work as firemen. And they had a big bunkhouse out there, and they lived there. And one of the person that you're talking about, the victim, so to speak, was I think a railroad worker, but a part-time fireman, and was living there in the bunkhouse. And the chief, trying to be as delicate as I can here, caught him back in the back of the bunkhouse
Enjoying himself.
enjoying himself. Yeah, let me put it that way. That's a good way to put it. And grabbed him and pulled him out in Nolensville Road by his
Private parts.
lower extremity. And later on, the victim filed a suit against the chief, claiming that he'd been damaged for life. And our defense was that he hadn't been damaged, that actually he'd profited from it because, you know, elongation might have taken. But anyway, the jury came back and found for the plaintiff, the guy, the victim, and gave him a penny. And said it really probably wasn't injured, it's like he claimed he was. It might have enhanced him a little bit.
Did you actually
But
get the penny?
that case. I mean, that case was actually tried, took in front of Judge Bird Douglas.
Well, there was quite a bit of publicity about that case, as I recall.
Quite a case.
Jack, I want to switch gears and go into another aspect of your life. And you're a very diverse person. I mean, you're a jogger. You're a parachutist. You do all sort of. You're a boater. You do a lot of outside things that most people would find interesting. But you, at one time, were in charge, or you had contracts with most of the state fairs, at least throughout the southeast and northeast United States, did you not?
Well, I was, my brother-in-law, Eddie Zakeen, and I bought a circus from a man named Doc Brawley down in Lawrenceburg. And Doc had a string of fairs, and he put on the grandstand shows. And we bought his business and started putting on grandstand shows at fairs and auditorium shows. And yes, so that was, we did very well with that business. We didn't have as many state fairs. We had a lot of county fairs. We had 2 or 3 states. We had Missouri State Fair at Sedalia, DeCoin, Illinois, Ohio State Fair. We put on shows there.
Mid-South and Memphis, didn't you?
Mid-South Fair in Memphis.
Tennessee State Fair?
Tennessee State Fair. Remember one year that I had Tennessee State Fair, and I got with Joe Sullivan and Steve Greel, who owned Sound 70, they produced auditorium shows. And we had the whole grandstand for the Tennessee State Fair, and the first weekend we had Mac Davis and Black Oak, Arkansas. Of course, I'd never heard of Black Oak, Arkansas, but we opened with them, and they didn't do too well. I mean, in fact, we were about $30,000 in the hole, and of course, I didn't have $30,000, didn't know where it was coming from, but the next weekend, we had an act I'd never heard of called Leonard Skinner. And I was worried to death about where we were going to get the money to pay off what we owed, and that Saturday morning, we had them on there Saturday night. I got there real early, and people were already lined up out waiting to get in. And to make a long story short, it just sold out, and standing room and everything else. And we made enough money out of Leonard Skinner to pay off our debt and put something in our pocket.
Well, not only Leonard Skinner, but you also had several big-name acts that you would put into these fairs over the years.
Yeah, we bought 3 Stooges here in Nashville. We bought McGuire Sisters here in Nashville. We bought a lot of acts to different other shows. I remember one time we had the Mid-South Fair in Memphis. And at that time, I represented the Hubert Long Talent Agency here in Nashville. And the Showman's Convention was in the old Sherman Hotel in Chicago. And I asked Hubert, I said, why don't you go to Chicago and let's try to put some country acts in some of these fairs? So he and I went up there in his old Packard Clipper. He had that Packard Clipper. And Bill Wynn was the manager of the Mid-South Fair in Memphis. And we booked Mid-South Fair. We booked George Jones and Tammy Wynette. And we needed another act. And Hubert said, there's a fellow by the name of Charlie Pride that's coming along, and he's going to be good. So let's just put him in as the opening act, which we did. This was in November. About the first part of February, I get a phone call from Bill Wynn calling me everything that could be called because I had the nerve to bring an African American to the fair. And he said, the people in Memphis will kill me. And this was like about February. Well, Charlie hit it big. I mean, big time. And about I guess sometime in May, Bill called me back and says, anyway, Charlie will do 2 shows. They'd sold out everything. And of course, the show went off great. Charlie Pride was and is a great friend of mine, a great person. His wife, Roseanne, and he's been a real boost. I mean, he's a big-time country artist.
Well, speaking of circuses, your family brought the Shrine Circus to
My
Nashville.
dad did, right, yes.
For years and years and years,
Oh,
he
yeah.
did that, and he was the potentate there.
First game it was at the old Sulphurdale ballpark, down the baseball park. Then when Sulphurdale closed, it moved out to the old state fairground, the Horse Show Arena. And then from there, it went down to the Municipal Auditorium. And that's where it stayed. That's still there today.
Now, Jack, I know that you and your father and several people at 213 3rd Avenue North represented a lot of the celebrities of the day. A lot of those names are known and some of them are not known, and we certainly won't get into that. But your father represented, for example, Hank Williams Sr.
Right. That was in the old Exchange Building.
In the old Exchange Building, and they were very close and represented him for years, and several other celebrities of the time. Now, I know that you do not like to talk about people you have represented. You're very sensitive about attorney-client privileges and everything, but you were often, let me put it this way, you were often seen about town and Mario's restaurant and several other places with some well-known individuals, and some of which I can think about. In the business end of it, there was Dick Blake. You mentioned Hubert Long was there. Owen Bradley, of course, was one of the great producers of all time. Dottie West, Ferlin Husky, Billy Sherrill, and Nara Wilson. Now, maybe a lot of people don't know who they are, but can you just give them a thumbnail sketch of who those 2 guys are?
When I had the circus back, when I had the grandstand show, Ronnie Bledsoe was my organist. He played the organ. And Nara Wilson was my MC. And he doubled over driving the truck to haul the scene. And Naro went on to become a major country music producer. He produced Shania Twain and several acts. And of course, Billy Sherrill is known everywhere. In fact, there's a new book out now on Tammy Wynette. And if you read the book, most of it's about Billy Sherrill and about what a great producer he was and he is today.
A genius.
Billy's still one of my best friends.
Right. Well, and those were just 2, and then there was always Bobby Bear, Ray Price, Bill Anderson.
Well, I represented, as I told you, I represented the Hubert Long Talent Agency.
Right.
And all those people were in Hubert Long stars in his roster. And if they ever needed any legal help, he would send that up to me. And Some of them, you know, some of them I represented in divorce cases. Some of them I represented in contract cases, where maybe they didn't, for some reason they didn't show up for a date and got sued over that. One particular with George and Tammy, they missed a date in Marshville, Wisconsin, and got sued up there. And that time I had a 310 airplane, which is
The Redbird.
the Redbird, right? And we flew up there and got up there and settled the lawsuit. And then
I remember also Lynn Anderson, Glenn Sutton, Chris Christopherson, you said Charlie Pride, George Morgan, he was another one.
well, I think Dad represented George. I represented him on some things.
Did you enjoy that part of law, representing celebrities?
Yes, yeah. Most of these people were good people. I mean, they were just, you know, I didn't look on them as a celebrity. I looked on them as just a person I knew and a person here in Nashville.
And
You were involved in some of that. Ray
I was
Price,
involved in a little of that. Well, I want to switch gears and tell us about your life in the military after World War II. Did you remain in the Guard? Or?
Well, I came out of the military in the fall of 1946. I'd been overseas for almost 2 years. And they talked me into joining the reserves, which I was in that for 6 years. And when my time to re-enlist in the reserves came up, I was about ready to go down and re-enlist. For some reason or other, I didn't get down there in time, and didn't re-enlist. And about 2 weeks later, the Korean War started, and that was the first unit that got called up. So I missed Korea. But then there was a lawyer by the name of Howard Butler, who was a close friend of mine and was a major general in the Air National Guard. And he talked me into being interested in joining the Air Guard. You could take what they call the AFOQT, or Air Force Qualification Test. And if you pass that, you know, they could consider giving you a commission in the Air Force, which I did, and they did, and I went in as a first lieutenant and was first assigned to the Air Police Unit. At that time, we had RF-84s, fighter reconnaissance airplanes. But then shortly thereafter, we switched to the C-97, which is the old Boeing Stratocruiser, which was a complete and total new mission. And they'd started an aeromedical evacuation unit. And I got appointed head of that. And I stayed squadron commander for the 118th Aeromedical Evacuation Unit for 22 years.
What was your rank?
Lieutenant colonel when I came out.
You guys were the first to fly into Madrid, were you not?
We were the first to fly into Madrid. One of our typical runs was from Nashville to Bermuda to the Azores to Naples to Athens, Greece, back out Athens, Greece, back to Naples, back to Madrid, and back home. Then we started flying to Vietnam.
And you told me you came away from all that with a lasting impression about the young men and women who were serving.
Well, of course, during that time, this was in the 60s, when the country was in a turmoil. I mean, people were, upset about Vietnam, which they had a right to be. There was a lot of unrest in the country. Kent State had happened, unfortunate thing had happened. And there was the, hippie movement, which a lot of young people were involved. And it made you kind of lose your faith in American youth, although I'm sure they felt their cause was just. But when I became commander of that guard unit, I had the privilege of being the commander of some of the greatest young people I've known. I mean, they just restored my faith in American youth.
Yeah.
I mean, those young people, we had a lot of EMTs from the fire department that were medical technicians out there in the guard. And they would go on active duty tours out to Southeast Asia. And some of the letters that I received from the commanders over there, thank you, were very rewarding about those people.
How long did it take to fly from Saigon to Nashville back in those days?
Well, at that time, Saigon was the only airport that we could land in. The Cameron Bay and Da Nang, those other airports came along later on. But we would go from here to Fairfield, California, with Travis Air Force Base, Travis to Honolulu. And that flight from Travis to Honolulu is the longest overwater flight anywhere in the world where you don't have any place you can land. I mean, and we went an old C-124 by then, and it cruised along at about 180 knots. And of course, you're fighting a headwind going out, going westbound. And a lot of times, you get to the equal time point where you either had enough fuel to get to Hawaii or you had to turn around. A couple of times we had to turn around.
Point of no return.
In other words, you fly all day and then turn around and go back to where you started off from. But that didn't happen very often. But then from Hawaii to Wake Island, Wake Island to Guam. A lot of times you'd have to hold at Guam because the B-52s were coming in and out on bombing missions. And then Guam to Mactan in the Philippines. And that's probably the most dangerous. That make Vietnam look like a kindergarten. I mean, in Mactan, there was a place called Mary Bers. This lady made furniture, straw furniture, and she had her own police force. I mean, you had to. You walk in a bar there and in those towns, and the people had to take the gun off and hang it on the wall. I mean, it's like the Old West. And there was a place outside of Clark Air Force Base called Angeles. And I mean, it was a lawless town. But then you go into Vietnam, load and unload and come back out. Same thing back over again.
And it was cold and noisy.
Sir?
Cold and noisy.
Yeah.
In the airplane.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you also were parachutist, but you didn't jump in the Army, did you?
No, I was sport jump. The reason I got into it was because, getting back to General Butler, back in those days we had T-33 in the Guard. That's a trainer fighter plane, old F-80 Shooting Star. And General Butler, I'd go a lot of places with him. Now, I wasn't an Air Force pilot, don't misunderstand me, but I was on flying status because I was commander of the Aeromedical Evacuation Unit. And I'd go with him in the T-Bird. And we had a couple of flameouts, and guys tried to ride them in and got killed. Not out of this guard unit, but in the. So I decided I wanted to know if I'd have the courage to jump out of that thing if something happened. So I decided I'd go make a parachute jump. And that's what I did. And 250 jumps later, I'm still here.
You broke your leg one time.
Yeah, I broke my leg on the 205th jump. I didn't break it, I shattered it.
Well, you also used to fly helicopters in addition to
Yeah, for many years of my life, I didn't think I could live unless I had an airplane sitting out there. I had every kind of small airplane you can think about. And they served me well. I mean, when I was in the fair business, I practiced law all day. And about 4 or 5 o'clock, I'd get through it. I'd run out to the airport and jump in my airplane and go to where the fair was and put it on and then come back. I remember one night I had an old Navy on, and I was coming back from Florence, Alabama, to North Alabama State Fair. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I dozed off to sleep. The next thing I knew, I was over Bowling Green, Kentucky. I'd pulled the same thing these Northwest pilots did the other day. I overshot the town. But that got my attention real fast. And I was a good pilot. Huh?
You were a good pilot.
Yeah.
Mr. Norman, I had just a couple questions about back to the practice of law. What was it like to practice with your father?
I was always intimidated by my father. I don't mean that in the way of criticism. I mean, I thought he was the greatest thing that ever walked on 2 feet, and I still do. And one of my goals was just to say that, I'll be half the lawyer he is. But he lived and breathed the practice of law until he retired. He traveled a lot. He and Mom went everywhere in the world. I mean, we used to have a map down in the office of the places he had been, and I can't think of any place he hadn't been. He took there was a preacher here by the name of Parson Prentice Pugh, and he found out that Parson Pugh had never been to the Holy Land, so he took Parson Pugh to the Holy Land. My dad was not a religious man in the sense that he never went to church, but he knew more about the Bible than anybody I know. I mean, he was a student of religion and the Bible. And he and Mom used to go to South America a lot on the old fruit boats, United Fruit Line. They'd ride those boats down there. When I was little, he took my brother Bob and myself to Havana, Cuba a lot. We'd go to Miami, and there was a boat left out of Miami at night called the SS Florida. And we'd ride that thing over to over to Havana and stay a couple of days and come back. So that was one of our ventures that we went with. Back in those days, you didn't have any reservation about hitchhiking or getting out on your own. I remember when I was in high school, a friend of mine, Ken Rutherford, and I, we hitchhiked all over everywhere. We'd go off and stay for a week or so, just hitchhiking around. It was a great life. When I was, I think, a senior in high school, my dad and Mom decided that Bob and I, my brother Bob, needed to go to Chicago to see what Chicago was like. So they put us on the train, sent us to Chicago. We spent 3 or 4 days there in Chicago, had a great time. I went out to Riverview Park and met a little gal out there that I thought I was going to have a great future with. That didn't last long, but I wanted to go back the next week. No. But we rode the train up there because it's right in the middle of the war. And we had to stand up all the way to Indianapolis. And but it was fun. But, nobody thought anything about that. I remember one time Ken and I hitchhiked down somewhere in Georgia to see a young lady we knew from school. And we caught a ride coming back with a fellow who was some sort of an engineer. And this was right in the middle of the war, and we asked him, what he did. And he said, I'm working on something that's going to revolutionize the world. And so I can't tell you much about it, but he was working at Oak Ridge. And of course, later on, the bomb went off. And thank God for Harry S. Truman, the bomb. I was ready to invade Japan, but we were saved. So.
You also mentioned Mr. Hooker Sr. Were he and your father close?
He and my father were real close. In fact, God will know about this. There was a man by the name of Seth Walker, who was at that, he was older than my dad and Mr. Hooker, but he was kind of the, I guess, patriarch of Hooker, the Hooker law firm. And I remember that, as I say, my brother Seth, who's now a judge, a criminal judge, was named after Mr. Hooker. And I remember every Christmas, I'm named after Mr. Seth Walker, not Mr. Hooker. And I remember every Christmas, Mr. Walker would give my brother just an elaborate Christmas present. And I was so jealous I couldn't see straight. I remember one time he gave him a big train. And boy, I just said, why couldn't I have been named Seth, But that's when we were living over on Fairmont Drive.
Well, someone said that Mr. Hooker and Mr. Norman never discussed the cases they tried against each other, and they tried hundreds and hundreds against each other, but they never, when the case is over, they never mentioned it again. Is that
That's
true?
probably true, yeah. Back in those days, it wasn't unusual to get in fistfights in the courtroom. I remember Johnny Eskew used to be an assistant district attorney, and he was a fiery little fellow. Boy, he'd fight a bull's and Mac Robinson got in a few fights that I can think of. But of course today, you don't do anything like that. But my point is that they'd be adversaries in the courtroom, but like you say, when they walked out the door, it was a whole different thing. Best of friends and buddies, and that was it. And that was an accepted practice.
Well, Jack Norman Jr., thank you so much on behalf of the Bar Association for agreeing to do this. You've enlightened us and you've entertained us, and we're truly appreciative of you taking the time to share all these stories with us, and best wishes to you. Thank you.
Well, Hal, yesterday you had told me that I could get on my computer and look at some of the people that had done this before, so I did. I spent the whole afternoon looking at those people. And, I felt like, how in the world are you going to follow those acts? I mean, we had some of the most distinguished attorneys that have ever practiced law in Tennessee, including the Supreme Court justices and judges and outstanding attorneys. And here I come along, and I just thought to myself, boy, you talk about going from the sublime to the ridiculous. This is it.
Well, while you were not watching, it's already been decided by your peers that you belong very much in that group, and there's no question about that. And that's the reason that you are our first interviewee, and we were honored to do it, and thank you again so much.
Well, thank you, Al. Thank the Bar Foundation. All right.
Thank you, Jack.